Hey, storyteller, what needs to happen in your story in order for it to work and keep readers engaged? While every story is different, in order to be compelling, each needs to contain several essential story events called story beats. What are story beats and what are the 7 your story should include? Let's find out. Welcome to this week's writer coaching session. I'm Bridget from B Squared Writer Coaching, an author, editor, and your story coach, here to help you make your story powerful, polished, and publishable so you can move readers and help them experience your character's journey with maximum emotional impact. Before we get into today's topic, I have a gift for you just for visiting my channel. My free workshop, 6 Essential Elements of a Powerful Story. Wait, didn't I say 7 earlier? Well, yes, I'm not talking about story beats in this workshop, or well, not only about story beats. This workshop will give you an overview of how to ramp up much more than just your plot, which is where story beats come in. It will also help you power up your characters, conflict, setting, and theme, plus show you how to write all this in a way that makes readers feel like they're living the story with the characters. To access the workshop, just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/workshop. That's the letter B, the number 2, writercoaching.com/workshop. And be sure to stick around to the end of this video so you won't miss this week's Power Up, a super practical action step you can take right now in the story you're working on. What are story beats? This is a term that has been most often used in screenwriting, but has become more common in the publishing industry. It refers to a moment that propels the story forward and makes the viewer, or reader, wonder what could happen next. Some story beats are subtle, while others are more obvious. A story beat is much more than just an event in the plot, however. It is also tied to your character's emotional state and the development of the protagonist's character arc. When writing about events that occur during a story beat, authors must be sure to show those events taking place on stage instead of summarizing them or just telling the reader that they happened. Sometimes multiple story beats can occur in a single scene. This is especially true in short stories. Conversely, some story beats, especially in a novel, may take several scenes or even chapters to complete. This is often true of the climactic sequence for an epic story, such as high fantasy or science fiction. One of the most essential story beats is the inciting incident. This is the event that starts the story, or at least your character's adventure in it. Depending on the needs of your story, if you use the 3-act story structure, the inciting incident can occur near the beginning of the first act or near the end of it. Since each of these positions in the story carries different stakes and different requirements, I list them as 2 separate story beats. And that brings us to our first story event, the World Rocker. This is an event that disrupts the protagonist's ordinary world in an irreversible way. If you're familiar with the hero's journey, you know that the protagonist starts in what we call the ordinary world. This is the state of life for the protagonist as it's always been, or at least as it's been for some time recently. Your protagonist is going about life thinking everything is fine and she has no reason to change, then wham! Life is turned upside down. The World Rocker can, as I said earlier, be the inciting incident, or it can be an event that leads to it. This story beat occurs near the beginning or at the beginning of Act 1. It can be your opening scene or a scene that shortly follows. The next story beat is what I like to call the "You're Expelled" moment. Some people call it the first pinch point or first plot point. I like "You're Expelled" because this is the event that pushes the protagonist forever out of the ordinary world. There is no turning back. The protagonist is on the journey and things can never be the same again. In the "You're Expelled" story beat, an irreversible event forces the protagonist to leave the ordinary world and begin the adventure of the story. This can be a literal leaving of the ordinary world, for instance, in stories that include an actual journey and the protagonist has to leave home to undertake the adventure. Or this could be the protagonist is losing a job or having to leave a career behind, so his or her ordinary world is changing in that way. Or it could be the state of a relationship, like maybe a relationship that ends or a friendship is on the rocks. In other words, something significant changes in your protagonist's life. And it isn't something he or she can just reverse and go back to the way things were with a single decision. It is critical to show that your protagonist realizes he or she can't return to the way things were without moving forward. If you're using 3-act story structure, this story beat occurs at the end of Act 1. It is sort of the bridge between Act 1 and Act 2. And it can be the inciting incident, or it can be an event that the inciting incident led to or caused. Since these two story beats can be a little tricky and sometimes a bit confusing, I'll share my experience with the inciting incident from my novel, Keeper of Shadows. Warning, there are a few, well, I don't know if you'd really call them spoilers because this is part of the premise of the story, so I'll go ahead and share this with you. In Keeper of Shadows, the main character, Lisanne, falls under a debilitating curse that causes a type of physical illness and tremendous pain. When I was first writing the novel, I thought that was the inciting incident. But as I was submitting to publishers and literary agents, one of the publishers actually said that the curse itself wasn't the inciting incident. That was what I now call the world rocker. It did shake Lisanne's world, and it was irreversible at the time it happened. She couldn't do anything about it. And it did change her life in the way that she had to stop teaching and could no longer fulfill what her village considered a useful role in society. One of the laws in the village was that each citizen had to perform some kind of useful work for the village. This illness ended her ability to do that. The publisher I spoke with indicated that the true inciting incident was what I now call the "you're expelled" moment. Lisanne becomes banished from her village because her fellow citizens believe she is guilty of the crime of sloth since she can't work in the way that they think is useful anymore, and they blame some of the trouble that is happening in the village on her. They think she's brought bad luck or a curse upon the village, and so they kick her out. That is really the inciting incident because that's when her true adventure begins. If the citizens would have accepted her and let her go on about life as usual, even with the curse, she never would have left. That was the only home she knew, and with her personality, she wasn't really an adventurer, so she never would have undertaken the journey. So the inciting incident, the thing that truly starts the story, is the banishment, the "you're expelled" moment. For that reason, I was able to cut quite a bit out of the beginning and move that inciting incident up. So with this example, you can see how knowing our story beats and figuring out which events in our stories correspond to a story beat can really help us make our stories much better than they were originally. After the "you're expelled" moment, the protagonist enters the new world, or the world of the adventure in which the story will take place. This is the state of being, or the new place in the journey, that will encompass most of the story, the whole middle, the entire second act. Or if you're doing 4-act structure, this would be Acts 2 and 3, with the climax and the resolution occurring in the final act of the story. As the story progresses after the "you're expelled" moment, complications and conflicts should arise and increase. The stakes should also be ramping up all the time for your protagonist. We can have try-fail cycles, some victories, some defeats probably more often than victories, or you can have some false victories in there. The protagonist may encounter new allies and new enemies, or at least enemies he or she didn't know existed before. And that would lead to the third story beat I'd like to cover today, which is called the turning point. The turning point normally occurs in the middle of the story. It may also be called the midpoint of the story. In this beat, a conflict or dilemma forces the protagonist to either make a crucial choice or change direction. This sets him or her on an unchangeable path toward the climax. The turning point doesn't cause the climax, but it ensures that the protagonist is heading that direction and it can't be avoided. Your reader and your protagonist may not be aware of this during the turning point, but as an author, you should be. Turning points or midpoints can take several forms. One of my favorites is that the turning point causes the protagonist to become more, proactive in achieving the story goal instead of reacting to the negative circumstances and conflicts that have arisen. In this case, the turning point solidifies your protagonist's determination to achieve the story goal. James Scott Bell calls the midpoint or the turning point a "look in the mirror" moment. This event forces the protagonist to take stock and consider one of two things. It either forces the protagonist to take stock of himself and his relationship to the conflicts in the story. It may cause him to wonder who he is or what kind of person he is becoming. If he continues the fight he's been engaged in throughout Act 2, will he change? Will he like who he becomes? How will facing his inner challenges affect him? Will his life change in ways he may not like? What will he have to do to overcome the inner or external challenges facing him? Alternatively, he may be taking stock of the odds that are against him. This is more related to the external conflict than to how the protagonist himself will change. He may be wondering, can he even achieve the story goal or defeat the foe or finish the quest, depending on what type of story you're writing. Often at this point, the forces against the protagonist will seem far too vast and powerful for him to overcome them. The midpoint or turning point can also take the form of a false victory or false defeat. In a false victory, perhaps the protagonist does something that makes him feel like he has won or has achieved a step closer to that story goal, and then by the end of the story beat, he realizes that the victory wasn't really a victory, or it had consequences he wasn't expecting. In a false defeat, maybe the character feels like there's no way I can win this, no way I can achieve the story goal, and then something happens as a result of the event that gives him a bit of hope at the end of the scene. And don't confuse the false defeat here at the turning point with another story beat we'll talk about in a moment called the all is lost moment. Are you finding this helpful so far? If so, be sure to click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you won't miss future writer coaching sessions. And feel free to click the like button as well so we can help YouTube know to show this to more writers like you. One of the most enjoyable and the most daunting story beats we have to write is what I like to call the we're doomed moment, more commonly known as the all is lost or black moment. This is your protagonist's lowest point in the story, emotionally. In this story beat, a revelation or defeat occurs which makes your protagonist believe there is no way to achieve the story goal, confront the opposition, or perhaps even survive, depending on your story's stakes and the ultimate goal. In a romance, we often think of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, that sort of thing. This is the ultimate boy loses girl moment, only it seems there is no chance for them to ever reconcile. Though this is the protagonist's lowest emotional moment in the story, it will lead to a revelation or a decision that propels him or her toward the climax. One thing to keep in mind is that even if your protagonist's story goal is epic in scale, the all is lost moment needs to be intensely personal. It can't be just about how this defeat or revelation affects others or even the entire world at large. It needs to have some bearing on the protagonist's personal life or personal state. This is crucial in order to make readers care and truly feel the protagonist's pain. It needs to be something gut-wrenching for him or her on a very personal level. And bonus points if you have no idea how to get your protagonist out of this situation, or at least at first. If that's the case when you're writing this scene, readers won't have a clue how you're going to achieve that either. And nothing makes a reader turn a page faster than a character who's in a predicament that seems impossible to escape from. Where does this story beat occur? Sometime between the turning point and the climax. Usually a little closer to the climax, but not right before. This story beat doesn't cause the climax, but it does make the climax inevitable in some way. And how long should you wait between the all is lost moment and the climax? Well, that depends on the length of your story. Are you writing a short story? Well, that could happen in the same scene in that case. Or are you writing epic fantasy and your novel is a 500-page book? There's going to be a little bit of more time between the two, probably several scenes or even a couple chapters. Our fifth story beat is closely tied to the all is lost moment. It is the Epiphany. This is a startling revelation the character has as a result of or at the end of the all is lost moment. This revelation is often life-changing for your protagonist. During this revelation, the protagonist usually realizes he or she has a need that is far greater than the original want or desire, the original story goal. And for this reason, the story goal may change or deepen as a result of the epiphany. Since the epiphany occurs as a result of the all is lost or we're doomed moment, it can occur at the end of that scene that contains the all is lost story beat, or it may occur in a separate scene as your protagonist has had more time to process what happened in the all is lost moment. The epiphany may not just be a revelation. Usually it's accompanied by a decision, and that decision moves your plot forward. Keep in mind with all these story beats, no matter what scene we're working on, we do need to be constantly moving the plot forward. Now we have reached the climax of the story, the grand showdown, the face-off between your protagonist and the external or internal conflicts of your story, and often both at the same time. This may be a showdown between the protagonist and an actual enemy, or the enemy may be the protagonist himself. The important thing to keep in mind is in the climax, the protagonist confronts the source of the conflict in the story, and that can include an actual antagonist, the story's main obstacle, which can be just something that's standing in the protagonist's way of getting what he or she wants or needs, the protagonist's own internal flaws or negative desires, a force of nature like a natural disaster, disease, animals, etc. The supernatural, which can include supernatural forces, or a decision point for the protagonist involving his relationship with God or a religion. Or finally, a battle between free will and predestined state of being, like a prophecy or something prearranged by someone besides the protagonist on how his or her life is supposed to turn out. Remember, the climax is the point of highest stakes and highest tension in the story. If your protagonist loses this fight, his entire world is shattered, and others will suffer as well. During the climax, show your protagonist using what he or she has learned throughout the story and while facing the conflicts that have led to this. Depending on your protagonist's character arc, he or she will either use those lessons in a way that helps him overcome the antagonist or the obstacle or whatever your foe in the story is. That would be for a positive character arc. If your protagonist has a negative character arc, the climax will show him or her refusing to use what he or she has learned along the way and clinging to a negative desire or obsession to his or her detriment and that of others. Above all, make sure your protagonist is the architect of his or her own victory or defeat. If it's a victory, use those things he or she has learned along the way in order to accomplish the goal or fulfill the need. If the protagonist suffers a defeat, make sure it's not someone else's fault, but it's because he or she refused to use what was learned throughout the story in order to accomplish what he could have accomplished. This is the key to a satisfying ending to your story. Your protagonist must be proactive. If you have others intervene and save him, then the reader feels cheated. Or if the protagonist is defeated and had no hand in that, did everything he could, tried everything, used all the lessons learned, and still lost anyway, then readers will be mad and throw the book across the room. You don't want that either. The final story beat is the resolution. You may call this the aftermath of the battle or climax. When I was co-teaching a creative writing class to high school students with my friend Rebecca, we called this the "you should see the other guy" moment. It's what happens after the battle. Who got injured, who lived, who died, what happened to the world as a result. In this story beat, we need to show that the protagonist has either achieved the story goal or failed to do so, depending on which character arc we're using. One of the main points of the resolution is to show how your protagonist has changed or caused change in others. You can do this in one or more scenes after the climax, depending on the length of your story. If you're writing a short story, this may be a few sentences or a paragraph or two. If you're writing an epic tale or huge novel, this may take several scenes or even a few chapters. The resolution shouldn't be too long, though, because after the climax, the reader needs a reason to keep going. The resolution should also show what your character has learned or ignored. And be sure to show, at least to some extent, how the events of the story have affected the setting, the story world, the other characters, and the culture, whatever else the events of the story may have affected. If you haven't done so already, be sure to sign up for my free workshop, 6 Essential Elements of a Powerful Story. Remember, just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/workshop. For this week's Power Up, make a list of the 7 story beats we've covered today, and next to each, write the scene or event in your story that corresponds with it. If any beats are missing from your story or fail to accomplish what they should, write new scenes or work on the existing ones to either add the beats or strengthen those that are already there. One way that may help you keep track of all this, to outline your story's beats or even add or rearrange scenes if you need to, is to use an application like Scrivener. It's designed by writers for writers, and you can use it for writing your story, plotting your story, even revision, editing, keeping track of things like story beats. Its corkboard feature is great for creating a post-it note style outline of your story, similar to how many authors will use post-it notes or index cards for certain scenes. And you can use the labeling features or flag certain scenes either using the corkboard or the labels in what they call the binder, which is the list of chapters and folders that runs down the side. You can color code these labels and label your scenes according to the different story beats so you can keep track of all that. This way you can make sure you're not missing anything crucial. You can also use this labeling for identifying which character's point of view is used in a scene. And there are many other ways to use these features. If you'd like to check out Scrivener, it is available for Mac and PC, and I have a link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss next week's writer coaching session. As I mentioned earlier, story beats are closely tied to your protagonist's character arc, since really character and plot can't be fully separated, and shouldn't be. What is a character arc and which one should you use for your protagonist? Check out this video to find out. In the meantime, let's power up your storytelling.